Welcome back. In this new section of videos, we're going to take the platform as a service idea and really talk about some of the more outlier capabilities within Azure, but that are still focused around data. Now, the majority of these are going to be more heavily used by, say, developers or data analysis individuals, data scientists, things like that. But those who are owning your Azure subscriptions or are cloud architects need to understand how these services are deployed, how they can be configured, how they can be monitored, because it's going to be your responsibility to do that while the developers or the analysts or the scientists are actually working with the data inside of the services. So we'll be talking about what I call data processing as a service. Now within that, we're going to focus on four major services within Azure. The first is full text search as a service, where Azure is providing elastic search capabilities within the scope of Azure. The second is data messaging and event-based applications, building event-based applications as a service, and we actually have a number of different capabilities inside of Azure to provide that. I mentioned one when we covered Azure Storage in the Infrastructure as a Service video series, but there are another set of capabilities beyond just Azure Queues, which, as I mentioned, focus on storage accounts, such as Event Hubs, Service Bus, IoT Hubs, and those all focus around data messaging. And then we will talk about the extract, transact, and load as a service capability, which we are calling Data Factory, where you can actually build data pipelines for extracting data, manipulating that data, and then loading it into a secondary source, and some of the great integrated capabilities that are available inside of Data Factory. And then lastly, we will talk about cataloging your data as a service with Data Catalog. Now, in this particular video, though, we're going to focus on the full text search as a service. Now, we're not going to be diving into the development or the integration of your code with the search service. At the end of the day, it is a public endpoint, but it is providing that full text search capability that a lot of people look for, maybe from, say, an Apache Solr, which is built on Lucene, both of those being open source. Now, it just so happens that Microsoft provides full text search as a service using an open source tool as well, and that is called Elasticsearch. Now, Elasticsearch is part of the ELK stack. Azure does not provide Logstash or Kanban as a service, but it does in fact provide Elasticsearch as a service. Not only is it the standard full text indexing, searching, and text analysis, but it also provides a number of fantastic user experience features, such as providing recommendations, things of that nature. The other great thing about Elasticsearch inside of Azure, unlike what you would get if you were to deploy it yourself, download it, and deploy your own VMs, is that there is direct data integration with specific Azure services for ingesting of data and creating your indexes on the fly and actually continually updating your indexes on the fly based on some of those services, and we'll talk about that. And I actually mentioned it briefly when we were going through the Azure SQL walkthrough. There is actually an item in Azure SQL that will allow you to integrate directly with Azure Search. And then lastly, the monitoring and analytics, because as easy as it might be to spin up a new index and to ingest that data from Azure SQL into your Azure Search, you still need to monitor and analyze the data that's coming out of Azure Search to validate that you've built your indexes appropriately, that people are actually finding the data through their full text searches that they are actually looking for. So with that, let's head on over to the portal. We'll walk through a quick creation of an Azure Search Index, and then we'll go from there. Okay, here we are back in the portal, and search actually falls fairly far down into the navigation. So rather than scrolling down, I'm just going to type in search, and when I do that, you can see I have a search services item. So that is what I'm going to click on here to create a new Azure Search service. Now, this is fairly straightforward. There isn't a lot to the creation of a new search service. The first thing is going to be specifying a URL. It's then going to be that URL that your applications are going to use and your development code is going to use in order to interact with your search service, whether it's being actually performing a search or making modifications to the data within the search based on your application's usage. So what I'm going to do is just call this packed publishing, And we have ourselves a URL that you can see will be paxpublishing.search.windows.net. Then, as per usual, you specify a resource group and you specify a location. I'm perfectly fine with West US. We're just doing this for demo purposes. The next is, of course, the pricing tier. And just like I've shown you with many of the other services, there is a large number of different pricing options, although for search there's really only 6. Now, of course, the first one is free. You're allowed up to 3 total indexes inside of your search service, 50 megs of index storage. You're sharing resources with other customers, and there is no scaling option. Now, scaling options are going to be used primarily for the actual searching against your indexes, not necessarily for keeping your indexes up to date, because predominantly the majority of full text search service usage is going to be from the users who are actually performing the searches. The next tier is your basic tier, where you're allowed up to 15 different indexes, 2 gigs of total storage. You do start to get dedicated resources that will be dedicated to you and your search service. You get up to scale up to 3 search units, therefore allowing for auto scaling based on usage. And you also get replicas of your indexes for load balancing purposes. With the standard tier, we start to add additional capabilities. We now get up to 25 gigs of partitioned storage, 50 total indexes, dedicated resources still. You now get up to 36 units for scaling, and up to 12 replicas and up to 12 partitions with 25 gigs per partition, therefore allowing you up to 300 total gigs of search space. And then there are different levels of the search tier with 200 indexes for S2 and S3, 100 and 200 gigs respectively for storage per partition. We still get up to 36 search units and 12 replicas for both load balancing and 12 partitions. And then the last one is really for software as a service type applications, e-commerce applications. Like, for example, if you were ever to deploy, say, Walmart into a software as a service application, this is the type of search service that you would want to use. 1,000 indexes per partition with 200 gigs per partition. That's terabytes worth now of search storage. But you still get the 36 units of scaling, 12 replicas. You now only get 3 partitions, but you're deploying this all on high density enabled environments, therefore SSD drives to provide the best level of searching capability against, and the fastest searching capability against the indexes that have been built. The thing, of course, to keep in mind if you are not necessarily familiar with search services in general is all of the indexing that is created to provide these very quick full text searches is stored on disk. So the majority of the processing is going to be I/O against those indexes that are stored on disk. So you provide SSD drives versus your standard digital drives. You're now providing better read and write speed to those indexes. So for my purposes, I'm just going to choose the S1 standard, go ahead and click select, and then click create. Once we've got our search service up and running, I'll bring you back in and we'll look at how you can configure and leverage the search service for your applications. Okay, so we've got our new search service. Let's go ahead and click on in. And the first thing is we've got our status showing is running. We've got our URL, and of course that will be the URL that we'll use to contact the search service. Now, in order to add data to the search service, the first thing, of course, is you have to have an index. So we're going to create a new index. We'll call this products. And then you're going to want to create multiple fields. The first one is going to be an ID field. That's perfectly fine. Let's say we're going to give a name, we're going to give a description, and we're going to give a price. Now the price is not going to be a string, it's going to be a double because it's going to be both dollars and cents. And then you need to specify some configuration options for your individual fields. Is the field retrievable? Is it filterable, sortable, facetable, and searchable? These will all determine how a user will actually be able to retrieve this data, whether the data is indexed or not, whether it's filtered, sorted, so on and so forth. And of course, the ID is going to be the primary key, so it's always going to be available. It doesn't necessarily mean that you want the ID to be sortable or filterable, because most users, the everyday user coming into Walmart doing a search for a product does not care about the ID of the product. They only care about the name, the description, or the price. So if I go ahead and I click OK for this, I've now got 4 fields. But in addition to the basic items that I can specify here, matter of fact, I'll do filterable, sortable, and fast and searchable. And then if we go over to Analyzer, you can actually, in addition to specifying whether or not something is searchable, you can actually specify the analyzer that's being used against the particular field that is now searchable. So if you know for a fact that you've got a field or multiple fields that are going to be needing to be searched using a different language, for example, and you can see that there are a number of different options here as far as analyzers are concerned, with ones that were created by us, Microsoft, and other analyzers that were created by Lucene. Lucene being, in my opinion, the most prominent open source search indexing library available for many, many years. I actually built an application on top of it years ago myself, back when there was a Lucene and a Lucene.net. And I know that there are other options for Lucene as well. Apache Solr, for example, is actually a search indexing service that's built on top of the Lucene libraries. But there are many, many analyzers that Lucene provides, and you can actually select these as your analyzer for the searchable field that you've created. You can now, by default, it's always going to be the standard Lucene, which is assuming English, but you can also specify, obviously, one of these others. You also have the ability to go over to the suggester and whether or not this particular field should be used for suggestion purposes inside of the user interface. This is how you're going to actually create your index and configure your index before the developers actually work against the index inside of their applications. So you can see that there is definitely a different delineation between who's going to work with and configure Azure Search versus who's going to develop against it. There's a different level of understanding that needs to be had. Now, I'm not going to put in any particular suggestions, but you can actually give it a suggester name. But what I am going to do is just go ahead and click OK. I've now got my 4 fields in my index, and I now have a new index that is been created. And then within this index, you can see right from the overview page how many documents have been put into this particular index and what the storage size is of this particular index. Now, as I mentioned, every single tier, you're allowed multiple indexes, and then those indexes can be partitioned across multiple partitions if you should so need. Now, in order to provide access to the developers for your search service, in addition to the URL, they're going to also need to have an access key. And this is not any different from, say, Azure Storage, which also works very much the same way. But you also, in addition to having your primary and secondary administrative keys, which maybe your developers need if, in fact, they're making adjustments to the index on the fly within their applications. And I mention that because that was something that I actually did in my application that I wrote, where the data was consistently being updated and they were being updated by the users. So at the time when the update was made, say, within the database, I was automatically also updating the indexes. But if you only want to provide for query-based access to your search service, then you can actually create query keys that can then be provided to certain applications that will only be allowed to do queries against your index. Then from a scaling perspective, we talked about the fact that certain tiers do provide scaling. You can actually specify in here how many replicas you actually want to provide for availability of your search service. Now, these replicas will exist as read-only replicas, and they will only exist in the same region as where you created your index. So if you do need to provide search service capabilities in a geographically distributed application, then you are going to unfortunately need to create a search service in each of those regions in Azure to provide the lowest latency for your querying capabilities. You also have the ability to create partitions, and this is, of course, allowing you to then break up your index into multiple chunks across those partitions and out in order to provide the best searching capability. And then those two things combined will provide your scaling totals. In other words, the number of search units that are available. It's the number of replicas times the number of partitions. I also then mentioned that from within Azure is where you're going to start to look at things like search traffic analytics, and you can actually use application insights to provide information about your search indexing by leveraging some .NET code or JavaScript code to get telemetry pushed from your application into Application Insights to provide analytic information about how your index is performing, how queries are performing against your index, and things like that. So there's a lot of great capabilities here. We can see here that this is actually creating the necessary telemetry and pulling this information out and then allowing you to push it into Application Insights. Aside from that, we of course also have all of the standard monitoring capabilities for Azure Search, where we can actually create diagnostic logs and have those pushed to a storage account, Event Hub, or so on. We can also look at metrics from within the search service. Now, of course, these are going to be real-time metrics against this specific search service. If you want to see something that's in more of a log format, then you're going to go back to the search traffic analytics and use Application Insights for that. But this does allow for things like search latency, queries per second, throttled search queries percentage, things like that. You can also, of course, create alerts against your Azure Search Service. Now, as I mentioned, the Azure Search Service is built on top of Elasticsearch. It is not a most recent, up-to-date version of Elasticsearch. If you do want to find out exactly which version, you can find that out from within the Azure Search documentation. But keep in mind that there is no way for Microsoft to continually keep updated a service within a public cloud at the same rate that Elasticsearch is providing with new versions of their software. So there is definitely going to be some lag. At the same point, if you are familiar with Elasticsearch, you understand its capabilities, you've developed against it in the past, then this is probably a great way to offload the administration of your search index and make it available as a publicly consumable service inside of your cloud. With that, as I mentioned, the search service is not necessarily that deep of a topic from an Azure perspective. The majority of the information, say, in the documentation is going to be more tied to developers, so I highly recommend that your developers take a look at our documentation, and I, of course, will provide that as a link at the end of the section. So with that, let's head back over to the deck, and we'll talk about what's coming next.